Hello, hello. Oh, it's a big microphone for a big room. Very nice. Welcome here. You guys have a nice little dinner, get some dessert. You're not even going to need the coffee. We're going to keep you awake tonight. It's going to be such a vibrant, engaging conversation. Go for the decaf. I'm telling you, you'll be up all night otherwise. Welcome here to the Oshman Family JCC. I'm Zach Bodner. I'm the CEO. Welcome to our Architects of the Jewish Future speaker series. Raise your hand if you've been to one of these before, one of our speaker sessions. Okay, a handful of you. So raise your hand if this is your first one. Okay, we got a good crowd, a little bit of a mix. We have a really special speaker tonight. We have a really special setup tonight, but we also have the opportunity for the first time to be live streaming this around the globe to whomever is logging in at whatever address. I'm sure that those folks know that out there, but thank you to April and Raymond Stern for the equipment for making our live streaming happen tonight, making it possible. Thank you guys. It just means I have to make sure there's no food in my teeth, right? Am I okay? It's good because the camera's on. All right, tough crowd tonight. Sorry, Bob. I'm doing my best here warming them up, but it's like the food coma's hidden. I see how it is. That's all right. We're gonna get you going because it's gonna be a great topic today. We're talking about the issue of Jewish identity. It's a big topic, right? Jewish identity. I can tell you that 200 years ago, if you were Jewish in America, it said everything about you, right? Not that there were a whole lot of Jews 200 years ago, but in 100 years, if you were Jewish back then, it said where you lived, how you dressed, how you ate, who you married, what you did for a living. Today, if you're Jewish, it could be anything. It doesn't tell you anything about your identity. You might also be a grandmother. You might be an actor. You might be a soldier. You might be a politician. You might also be Jewish. Being Jewish could just be one piece of your identity. So figuring out where the Jewish fits in is a challenge. And as we think about our kids and our grandkids, we want to make sure that the Jewish piece of their identity stands out, that they appreciate that it's important, that they embrace it, right? We want to make sure that they understand that it's important to us. That's why we're spending so much time and energy and hopefully money at the JCC, right? That's why we're engaging so much, because we care about our Jewish future. And who better to talk to us about Jewish identity than somebody who's written an incredible book about the future of American Jewish identity, Professor Bob Mnookin. Now, we have an interesting setup for tonight. Professor Mnookin is going to talk a little bit, and then Dan Libenson. How many of you know Dan Libenson from the Judaism Unbound podcast? A fantastic podcast, yes? Raise your hand if you listen to the podcast. Okay, so there's like 4. Dan, that means you got a lot of new potential listeners. Yes, I know. This is a crowd that's going to walk up to you afterwards saying, how does this thing work? I understand. I get it too, because I've asked him how to set it up on my phone. But it's worth it. Figure out how to make the podcast thing work on your phone, because this is a fantastic podcast. And I'm not just saying that because I've been on it 3 times. It really is a great podcast. He's got great speakers, really great content. And that's how we learned about Bob Mnookin, is because we heard about him on Dan's Judaism Unbound podcast. Then we picked up the book and we said, we got to bring him here. So let me tell you a little bit about Bob, and then I'm going to turn it over to him. But he's got an impressive bio, so I have to read a little bit of it. It's amazing that I'm a Yaley, and we have 2 Harvard guys on the stage right now. It's pretty impressive, but I won't hold it against them, and I encourage you not to either. Okay. But Bob did his background, his undergraduate degree from Harvard. He got his law degree from Harvard as well. He is taught at Stanford Law School. He's taught at Columbia Law School. He's taught at Bolt. He has clerked for U.S. Supreme Court Justice John Harlan. He has a great background. He's written or edited 10 different books. He is now you're back at Harvard Law School, if I remember. And this latest book is called the Jewish American. See, this is the thing: the Jewish American Paradox. The Jewish American Paradox, not the American Jewish Paradox. The first iteration of the title, you should know, which I thought was a really cool iteration of the title, was called Going from Chosen to Choosing, which is a great line. It's actually a line in there in the book. So I'm not going to tell you what page, because you have to buy it. And then you have to read it, and you're going to see what page it's on. But we have the books for sale tonight. Bob will be signing them if you're lucky enough to pick one up for tonight. So I really hope you enjoy tonight's program. I really hope you engage. He's going to speak. Dan's going to interview him, and then you're going to have a chance to engage with him as well. So without any further ado, I'm turning it over to you 2 gentlemen, Bob and Dan.
Well, Zach, thank you so much for having me here. And I want to thank Tova for figuring out all the logistics, and most of all, Dan, too. Dan, I met Dan through his podcast, although he was a student in my course, but it was a big class, and we didn't really know each other. In all events, my book is about the puzzling nature of Jewish identity in America and about the challenges facing the American Jewish community. And what I'd like to do just in a very few minutes is tell one story out of the book, which really relates to the first chapter. And it involves the paradoxical life story of Erik Erickson, who was one of the world's most influential theorists on the subject of identity. Who here has heard of Erik Erickson? Many of you have. That's terrific. Well, I first met Erickson in 1975. He had recently retired from Harvard University, where he was a professor while I was an undergraduate. But I never took his course as an undergraduate. But he was, in fact, a real faculty celebrity. The reason I met him is because as a young academic, I was teaching at Berkeley at the time. I was invited to be part of a faculty seminar that met once a month with Erickson. He just moved back to California from Cambridge, and he was working on ideas relating to the last stage of life. Now, Erickson is famous because for a number of reasons. First, he was psychoanalyzed by Anna Freud, and he, in fact, knew Sigmund Freud as well. Second, he, in fact, developed an extraordinarily influential theory of human development. Freud's theory of development really focused on very young children. It really only focused on early stages. And Erickson, in fact, developed a theory that had 8 stages throughout life. And his notion was each stage had a characteristic challenge which you had to work your way through. Moreover, he had won both the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize for 2 extremely influential biographies. He was the first to sort of almost develop a notion of psychobiography. At Harvard, when I was there, I of course knew all about him because he was a faculty celebrity, and he taught a course called The Human Life Cycle. I think it was Social Sciences 139. And it had a reputation for being extremely popular, often oversubscribed, and also had a reputation for not being too tough. But I mean, that's beside the point. Now, in this faculty seminar, I was an outlier in the sense that I was a law professor. But at the time, I had done a fair amount of research relating to children in the law, family law, et cetera. And I jumped at the opportunity to be with this group of primarily very distinguished psychologists, psychoanalysts, et cetera. Through the seminar, I got to know Erickson a little bit. And I immediately took a liking to him. At 72, he was an extremely handsome man with blue eyes, a light reddish complexion, and a striking mane of white hair. He was very courtly, and he reminded me in one way of my own grandfather because he wore one of these Western string ties, with a piece of jewelry holding it together, which my grandfather, George Sittenfeld, used to wear too. He was soft-spoken. He spoke with an accent, which sounded Germanic, but I assumed he was Scandinavian. Well, thank you. As a result, at a dinner party, shortly after this seminar began, Dale and I were invited to a small dinner party with Erickson and his wife, Joan. And Dale sat next to, my wife Dale, who's here, sat next to Erickson. And Erickson said to Dale, "What kind of name is Mnookin?" And Dale said, well, it comes from a Hebrew word and it means at rest or peace. And Erickson looked at her and said, are you Jewish? And Dale said, yes. And he said, you don't look Jewish. Now, Dale smiled, and he then said to her, you know, I write about identity. Dale, of course, knew that he wrote about identity. But little did either of us know how important it was to Erickson not to have a Jewish name and not to look Jewish. Because while this faculty seminar was meeting in 1975, there was a front page New York Times book review of his collection of essays. And it was entitled Erik Erickson, the Man Who Invented Himself. And in fact, it was written by a guy named Marshall Berman, who had a Harvard PhD and at the time was at NYU. And the first paragraph of this review gave no hint of kind of what was to come, and it couldn't have been more complimentary. It read, and I'm quoting, Erik Erickson is probably the closest thing to an intellectual hero in American culture today. 3 paragraphs later, though, Berman revealed what for me was an absolutely complete surprise. He wrote, and I'm quoting, like many of the outstanding intellectuals of our time, Erickson grew up as a Jew in Imperial and Weimar Germany and crossed the water to America during the Hitler years because of an inner need. And he described the inner need as the need to abandon his Jewish and German refugee status and reinvent himself as a man of Danish Gentile ancestry. Now, Berman's harshest criticism focused on what Erickson had omitted from an autobiographical essay that was part of this book of essays that was being reviewed. He had indicated in that essay that his stepfather, Dr. Theodor Hamburger, was Jewish and that he had been raised in a Jewish home. But what he did not omit, what he did omit, however, what he failed to state was that his mother, nay Carla Abramson, had been Jewish too. And that what was clear is Erickson never knew who his father was. Hamburger had adopted him. Anyway, Berman was extremely critical of what Erickson had done. And he said that he had repudiated his stepfather, whose Jewish name he should normally have bared, and that what he had, in Berman's words, was the chutzpah to name himself Erik Erickson, in the most literal sense, a self-made man, almost named after himself. Berman was critical because Erickson had never indicated that he had come to America as a Jewish refugee, that he had to come. Anyway, the review was extremely harsh. And it said that Erickson, in fact, had been living a hypocritical life because his own developmental theories emphasized integration and dealing with, your own past. Well, shortly after the review appeared, the seminar met for what I think was the last time, and Erickson did not show up for this meeting. I suspect he was a little embarrassed. There's a very good biography of Erickson written by a man named Friedman, who said that this whole episode was extremely traumatic for him. And that we as a group sort of talked about what should we do, because we liked him personally and he had really been viciously attacked. What we didn't discuss, though, were the issues relating to Jewish identity that arose, at least for me, from Berman's review. Berman seemed to assume that the way to determine whether someone was Jewish was to apply the matrilineal principle of Jewish law. Erickson's mother was Jewish. Therefore, Erickson was Jewish. Well, does that mean that he was forever Jewish? Was his biological father's background of no relevance? Was Erickson not allowed to forge his own identity? Moreover, I wondered, had Erickson converted to Christianity? And if so, shouldn't that be relevant to his identity as a Jew? Like others in the group, I was unwilling to be critical of Erickson. I wanted to know more facts. And in fact, I have a chapter in the book where I really go into some detail about Erickson's background. No one in our group at the time, even though there were about a dozen of us in this group, and I'd say 2/3 of us were Jews, one way or another. And what none of us really talked about was the most troubling question raised by the Berman Review. And was this man we liked and admired, this man dedicated to identity and wholeness, a self-hating Jew? I was raised to believe that it was wrong to try to pass as a Gentile. But when I think about Erickson, I wondered, is it always wrong? What if a person feels no connection to Judaism as a religion or to the Jewish community? What if the burdens of anti-Semitism become unbearable, as they may have been for Erickson? Why should it be wrong to stop identifying yourself to others as Jewish under such circumstances? In other words, why shouldn't you be allowed to opt out? Now, questions like these, some 40 years later, really contributed to my deciding to write this book and to puzzle about what it means to be Jewish. By untangling in part Erickson's story and by doing many other things too, I thought maybe I could, for myself at least, better understand how we in America ought to think about being Jewish. Now, I will not go on to elaborate because Dan has so many interesting things to say, but what I want to suggest is, and for example, the New York Times review indicated that the standard I end up suggesting in my book, they characterized it as revolutionary and perhaps heretical. And I must say, it gave me pleasure to think that I might be the first Jew since Spinoza who was a heretic. Because what I believe is the American Jewish community must become much more embracing. That in America today, many of our families are hybrid. If you go to Reform congregations around the country and visit the religious schools, a substantial proportion of those children do not have two Jewish parents, but one Jewish parent. I'm extremely critical of the matrilineal principle in the book, and what I end up proposing is a two-pronged standard. For the American community as a whole, I propose what I call a big tent standard, where what matters is public self-identification. If a person wants to identify with the Jewish community and the Jewish people, I don't care whether their mother's Jewish, I don't care whether their father's Jewish, and I also don't care whether they've religiously converted. Under this big tent, one thing that I think is fantastic about the American community, there's this extraordinary variety of institutions. Some are religious, ranging from humanistic Judaism, which is not theistic at all, to the equivalent of Haredim, who are ultra-Orthodox, with many stops in between. Apart from religious institutions, we have Jewish community centers, Jewish film festivals, Jewish federations, Jewish family services, this extraordinary variety of institutions. These individual institutions, as far as I'm concerned, because I'm a liberal, can set any standards they want for who can be a participant in their particular institution. But what I reject is the notion that any have the right to impose a standard on the community as a whole. Now, I talk about other challenges to our community in addition, but I wanted to sort of encapsulate a little bit just by way of introduction. Dan, I'm in your hands.
Okay, well, so just for our audience, I just want to say that I'm setting my watch here. My wife said that it was important for me to let you know that I'm setting the alarm on my watch so that you don't think I'm checking my watch to see if there's something more interesting going on. I'm setting my watch because I want to spend some time in conversation with Bob, and then we want to open up the room for your questions, because I think that the issues that we're talking about here, fundamentally, the issue that your book is about is this question of who is a Jew? What makes someone a Jew?
Who counts?
Who counts as a Jew? And I want to just start a little bit by asking you to tell a little bit of your personal story about why you came to write this book, because I think that your personal story is all of our personal stories, right? I think that the reason why this book needs to be written today is because every Jewish family is fundamentally, I think, asking themselves these questions because it matters very deeply to the family. So could you share a little bit of that?
Fair enough. In fact, this is the most personal book I've ever written because I really talk about growing up and my own relationship to being Jewish. I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri. I laugh because at times in my life, people say to me, are you from New York? And I'll leave it to you to speculate why they may think I'm from New York.
My wife's from South Carolina, and she gets exactly the same question.
And what I love to say in response is, no, actually, I was born in Kansas City. Both my parents were born in Kansas City, and all four of my grandparents lived in Kansas City. I'm a Midwesterner, and indeed, my own view in terms of identity is we all have many strands to our identity. And I assure you, an important strand of my identity is I'm a Midwestern kid from Kansas City. I grew up in an upper middle class, rather assimilated Jewish home. I went to Sunday school and was confirmed when I was 15. Our religious Temple B'nai Yehuda, which was formed in about 1875, did not have bar and bat mitzvahs in the 1950s. I grew up during the classical, the high water mark of classical Reform Judaism. I mean, we wanted to be as close to Presbyterians, in terms of outward manifestations as we could be, I suppose, because there was an organ, and services did not include very much Hebrew. My parents and grandparents were all philanthropically involved as Jews and otherwise in the community. And although my religious education was exceedingly thin, I did grow up feeling a deep commitment to what we now call tikkun olam. I'm not even sure in the 50s in Kansas City it had that label, but the notion that we had a responsibility as Jews to help heal the world, not just for Jews, but for society as a whole. As I say, my parents and grandparents were involved philanthropically with a variety of institutions, Jewish activities and institutions. The other thing I'll say about my own background is growing up, I never, in no sense did I ever try to deny my being of Jewish heritage. But on the other hand, if I'm honest, I felt it was a minor inconvenience. I went to a boys' school that in retrospect, I'm sure had a quota. When I was at Harvard College, the Porcellian Club and some other organizations didn't take any Jews. And in fact, one of the things I identify in the book is that really during my lifetime, I'm 77, there's been the most remarkable change in America where institutionalized anti-Semitism is essentially a thing of the past. Do not hear me as saying there are no anti-Semites in America. I mean, you'd have to be a fool to think that. But on the other hand, when I was growing up, there were Jewish country clubs, and then there were other country clubs that we weren't going to belong to. There were certain industries that Jews really couldn't get into. My grandfather, George Sittenfeld, in 1925, he'd already made some money and wanted to buy a house in what in Kansas City is called the Country Club District. He bought the house through a straw because it was restricted. I mean, there were all kinds of institutional mechanisms that involved discrimination against Jews, and that's gone by the boards. But my own background was thin, and it made writing this book had plenty to learn.
Well, and it's interesting though that you sort of put it that way, because you write in the book that one of the things that drove you to write the book was the fact that one of your daughters had married somebody who was Jewish, and one of your daughters had married somebody who wasn't Jewish, and you found yourself, once you had grandchildren, as wanting to have all of them have a Jewish identity, and then set out to try to figure out what that means. And what's interesting to me in the way that you just described this is two things. One is that you weren't driven to have them have a Kansas City identity, even though that was such a significant part of your heritage. And the other piece is that you defined your own Jewish identity as very much wrapped up with tikkun olam, with making the world better, meaning that it wasn't just a Jewish identity, it was an understanding that Judaism was about something.
And it carried certain, I hope, internal sense of obligation.
Right. And yet, I think that both you in the book and also all of us most of the time are particularly hung up on this question of does somebody count as a Jew or not? You know, that's the big worry that we all have, right? Will our grandchildren be Jewish or not? But not necessarily, but as long as they're Jewish, you know, maybe it's okay. You know, in other words, I guess I'm asking both, why is the Jewish question particularly significant as opposed to, for example, the Kansas City question? And I'm also asking why, at least as an initial point in starting the book, the driving question is, will they be Jewish or not? Like, where does that drive come from, or where do you feel that it came from in your own experience of it?
I think that's a great question. And indeed, it was that question that on an emotional level motivated me to write the book. One of my grandchildren's name, we call him Eli Alcott. On his birth certificate, though, his name is not Eli Alcott. It's Cornelius Alcott VI. And his father, Corey Alcott, is Cornelius V, and his grandfather, Neil Alcott, is Cornelius IV.
You got to give a long name to be able to get all these different nicknames
well,
out of
I'll
it.
tell you one little anecdote. When Allie told me, and Dale and I had both, although we met when we were very young and we've been married a really long time, but we both are, with our parents, no objections, dated non-Jews, and we never objected to who our children dated in that sense at all. And what I discovered is emotionally, I really hoped that Eli would take pride and grow up to think of himself as Jewish. And I asked myself, and it's what really motivated this project, what the hell is that all about? I say that because I don't like the phrase secular Jew, but I'm a non-observant Jew. You know, I go to services for high holy days some of the time. And I've never been religious. I don't think I'm an atheist, but I'm certainly an agnostic. And the religious dimension is not very central to me, and yet I cared. Now, of course, given our tradition and heritage, that's not so surprising. But what I really wanted to try to figure out was what does it mean? And I think the important question is not whether someone, obviously in terms of identity, I hope my children and grandchildren attach value to having a Jewish identity. But I think as you and I have discussed, I think the really critical question is a question that a friend of mine put to me, and that is, what difference does being Jewish make in terms of how you live your life? And I think particularly for those of us who are not religiously observant, that's not a simple question to answer.
Right, and I think I want to come back around to this if we have time, or we can talk about it also later. I mean, I think that one of the things that we've been trying to grapple with on our podcast is what is the right analogy for Judaism? That and it goes back to your point about the voluntary association, in the sense that sometimes, and you talk about how a lot of people today who are not observant experience Judaism, and you. There was a scholar who talks about it as symbolic ethnicity. I think that the idea that we eat bagels, it's like a symbol that we're Jewish, but it doesn't really mean anything. I mean, eating a bagel doesn't make me a better person in the world in any way. I don't think. I mean, so that's one approach that's kind of disappointing. That when we talk about a voluntary association, for example, I think a lot of people hear that as like, well, then it's all over. Then anybody can join.
That's right.
But I think of another voluntary association, which, at least for me, and I don't mean this as in a partisan way, but for me, it's being a Democrat. For another person, it might be being a Republican. But to me, that is an association that I chose. It has deep meaning. It predicts a lot of my ethical choices in life. I mean, if I tell you that I'm a Democrat, or I tell you that I'm a liberal Democrat, you can say a lot about me. And it's not just what I eat for breakfast. It's about me in the deepest way. And I guess that, what excites me about the idea of imagining Judaism as a voluntary association is the possibility that it will mean that again, right? That we can say, anybody who is a Jew, who declares themselves publicly to be a Jew, that really means something. I know something about that person. I'm wondering if you've thought about sort of what the process might be to go from here to there.
Well, I'm very sympathetic with that point of view, but I think it's very complicated. And the reason it's very complicated, and this is something I love about America, the variety of ways that Americans who identify as Jews express being Jews is unbelievably diverse. And I think for many, it is quite thin. And to some degree, that certainly can be a problem. But I guess, and you and I, for the two of us, the tikkun olam dimension is pretty central. But on the other hand, I don't feel I can claim that. I take enormous pride that if you look at American voluntary organizations that have been worried about the rights of women, the rights of African Americans, the rights of immigrants, the rights of gays, you find disproportionate numbers of Jews involved, both politically and philanthropically. And I think that's fantastic. And I think I see much of that as an expression, even when people aren't conscious of it, as an expression of their Jewish identity. In other words, it doesn't have to be strictly through just Jewish organizations. But on the other hand, as we know, there are a lot of conservative. There are Republican Jews too. You know, there are a lot of conservative Jews, and so.
Well, I want to come back around to some of that because I have two questions for you about bringing your professional expertise to this. So remind me, the second one is more relevant to what we're just talking about, which is I want to ask you a little bit about your perspective as a conflict resolution expert. But first, I want to ask you a little bit about how you bringing your expertise as a lawyer and as a law professor to this project, because I think it's worth. Oh, by the way, I wanted to note, by the way, that I did have a bagel for breakfast for anybody that's curious. But the question about I think that we're living in a time in Jewish history that's actually rather new in the history of the Jewish people, which is that there are many Jews in the Jewish community who are extremely well educated, who are not rabbis. This is a brand new phenomenon. I mean, in the last, let's say, 100 years or so, I mean, at a mass level, there were always maybe a few, but that almost by definition throughout Jewish history, to be an educated Jew meant to be a rabbi, and to be a rabbi meant to be plugged into the legal grappling over rules like who is a Jew. What's interesting now is that we have Jews that are highly educated in legal thinking who are actually American lawyers who are not rabbis. So what I think is really interesting is that this is an example, and perhaps the only one that I've seen, of an American lawyer coming to a Jewish question and saying, my expertise in law, not necessarily Jewish law, has something to bring to this conversation. That and when I was reading your book, actually, sort of for the second time, it really hit me that what was going on here was a form of Talmudic reasoning about this question about who is a Jew that is not present in the Talmud. And I guess I want you to if you could share a little bit about the specifics of your analyses of some of the core components that we usually think of as the definitional questions of who is a Jew. So the matrilineal principle for one, religious conversion as another, and perhaps others that you want to talk about. But I think it would be really interesting to share how you as a lawyer and a law professor come to these questions and say, actually they're not doing the work that you think they do. And they actually don't make sense as principles. So it's not only that we're departing from these because times have changed, it's that we're departing from these because they actually don't make sense when you really probe at them.
Well, that's an interesting observation. And I hope the book does not read like a legal text.
No.
On the other hand, it's certainly informed by my background because I really try to unpack the matrilineal principle. I studied its history, and I really tried to, and I make some arguments about why I think it's inadequate. I also analyzed the question, for example, to be a Jew, an obvious possibility is you have to have a commitment to Judaism as a religion. And what I analyzed, building on the work of other scholars, is that Judaism is a different kind of religion than Christianity or Islam. There's no catechism. There's no set of required beliefs. It's not a confessional religion. Deed counts more than creed. How you behave is more important. I've got a chapter on Are We a Race? And of course, post-Holocaust, the notion that we're a race is that I tell a story, profoundly offensive in many ways. And yet, of course, with 23andMe and the new biology, a lot of it's kind of coming in the back door. Although I think it's important to underscore that there is no Jewish gene. The idea of peoplehood is fascinating, but must it depend on descent or not? These are all really interesting questions, and I puzzled through a number of them, including Israel's own struggle with the question, which I think is not in any sense controlling for our country, about who counts as a Jew in Israel. But you're right that, in fact, that I'm a law professor informs this book. And, you know, I'll give you one small example. In the chapter where I finally spell out the the two-pronged standard I mentioned earlier that I proposed, I make this guy's a Harvard Law School graduate and also went to medical school. He's every grandmother's dream in that sense. But
Except I'm practicing neither, so it's really the nightmare.
In law school, a common hypothetical involves the following. There's an ordinance that says no vehicle in the park. And the professor asks where there's a fine if you have a vehicle in the park. Well, if someone drives a car in the park, everybody says, of course, that's no good. Well, how about a bicycle? You ride a bicycle in the park? Or a baby carriage? Is that a vehicle? And the purpose of the hypothetical in the first year of law school is to teach people that words do not have fixed meanings. And the meaning of vehicle may depend on the context. And I show how, for example, in Israel, in their struggles over who counts as a Jew, they had used different standards at different times. And therefore, I felt it appropriate to say, for America, we could have this very open definition, while for the Big Tent as a whole, but under the Big Tent, people could attach different definitions, that you didn't have to have one for everything. But anyway, that's
Well, so I mean, that brings me to the question about the other side of your expertise, and I worry that this is potentially controversial, but I'll ask the question, and you know, which is that your expertise as a conflict in conflict resolution, I think stems from your initial experience was in family law, which is really the law of divorce. And I'm curious about your standard and your work to define Jewish identity fundamentally is premised on the notion that we need to find an identity, right? We need to find a way to call us all Jews. And I'm in favor of that. But I want to raise the concern about the project that it's similar to the project of trying to save a marriage at all costs, right? That potentially there's a way in which by holding the relationship primary, it stifles the capacity of the individuals to become who they need to become. So my concern about an effort to maintain, to sort of define Judaism or Jewishness as opposed to Judaisms or Jewishnesses, right? That there's a way in which, for example, if I know that I have to maintain myself as a sort of a sense of a membership in a shared community with this other person who's so profoundly different from me, that I'm going to have to check myself. Like I'm going to have to not be able to be fully who I want to be, and that might be getting in the way of sort of a real flourishing. And I just sort of wonder, whether there's a way to kind of think about how or if there are other metaphors from the world of conflict resolution that are ways to kind of resolve the situation where maybe we need to have a different kind of relationship. I mean, maybe that would give more room for people to experiment and to flourish without worrying that they're going to kind of cause this terrible conflict with the other partner.
Well, I want to underscore something about my own posture, and that is it's premised on choice. So it's very individualistic in that sense, in that I also would allow people to exit by choice as well as come in. Now, to the extent you're saying, though, that you think it's important that there be one primary way to be Jewish, I don't buy it.
No, not one primary way, but that, for example, to take an extremely ultra-Orthodox Jew on the one hand and an extremely secular Jew on the other hand.
Yes.
If we require them to find a way to describe how they're both part of the same thing, then somebody's probably going to have to make substantial compromises. And sometimes that sounds like a really, really good thing. But sometimes you worry that because, for example, the secular Jew is compromising in order, right? Let's say, at all joint events will always have to be kosher, or whatever it may be, right? That there are ways in which that's not doing full honor to the capacity of the secular Jew to develop an exciting new way of being a secular Jew that really would look. I think another example of maybe where this plays out is in that you write about is in the situation between American Jews and Israeli Jews, because they're actually in two profoundly different spheres, right? In one case, the trend is to understand Judaism increasingly to be a national identity, and in the other case, it's very much going in the opposite direction, right? Because as intermarriage increases, et cetera, the sort of ethnic dimension of Judaism in America becomes increasingly reduced. And so for Judaism to really be vibrant, it's going to have to be more about the Jewish content that develops, whereas in Israel, it's more about the cohesion of the society. And in a way, those are on two sort of divergent paths. And the question is, how do they maintain the connection between them as they continue to diverge?
Well, I think, look, a different and longer conversation is, I think, for the American community in many ways, I am deeply committed to Israel's survival as a Jewish and democratic state. But Israel is a huge challenge, I think, for the American community in many ways because of certain governmental policies. And I think the two communities have very different primary challenges. Both are very diverse. But Israel's, in my mind, great challenge is, given real security concerns, how does it maintain itself as both Jewish and democratic? How it maintains that tension. For America, I think our greatest challenge probably is, are we going to transmit to the next generation a sufficient sense of being Jewish? And the paradox in the title of the book, which I really haven't mentioned, is the Jewish American paradox is, on the one hand, in the 2,000 years of the diaspora, in my view, there's never been a place like America where now Jews are integrated into our society and accepted in a way that has not been true anywhere else before to the same degree, on the one hand. And on the other hand, as we all know, there's great hand-wringing about, well, is it going to all last? Because since the year 2000, more than 50% of the Jews who married intermarried, and there's great fear that we're going to vanish. Now, I think that we're not going to stop intermarriage at all. I think it's kind of a fool's errand to think it's going to happen. But what we can do is try to embrace the next generation. That's our challenge. Now, these two challenges interrelate, because in some ways, having college students now, there are Israeli policies that make it harder, not easier, because there are a lot of young Jewish people who are upset and offended by what they see as illiberal policies of the Israeli government.
So let me ask you about that as my closing question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience, which is that as I understand, or as I recall, what you wrote about the what follows from that situation in terms of American Jews finding Israel to actually be a sort of a difficulty in their Jewish
Well,
identity, right? In the sense that in an earlier generation, it was actually a boon. I think a lot of it, particularly in the 50s and 60s, there was a sense that Israel, the building up of Israel, was actually something that was keeping American Jews strongly Jewish because they felt like they had an important project. And now the concerns about Israel's policies are often said by young people to be in the way of their feeling good about being Jewish because they feel that they're kind of that they're blamed for these things. But I want to ask you a difficult question about that, which is that in the book, as I understand it, you advocate that American Jews should be more vocal about their concerns about Israel's policies. I think both vis-a-vis Israel itself, right? That they should feel free to make their feelings known toward Israel, whereas in the past there was more of a message that said, you're not serving in the army, you shouldn't have a voice. And also that they shouldn't feel that it's wrong to, quote, air our dirty laundry, right? That they should feel comfortable to talk about their concerns about Israel in the public setting as well. Because only if they feel that ability to engage with Israel, bringing their concerns actively, only then will they be able to sort of generate a relationship with Israel. If you say you're not allowed to talk about your concerns, then they'll just kind of write it off. My only question and concern that I want to raise about that is, or it's really not, it's not something that I'm particularly concerned about, but a concern that I hear is that, is there a way in which Israel's security might end up in conflict with what American Jews need in order to stay Jewish? Meaning, if you believed, and I know you don't believe this, but if one believed that Israel shouldn't be criticized in public, because it's important for the message from American Jews to be a message of strong support for Israel in order for Israel to maintain its relationship with the United States and its various other elements of its security. If it were important for Jews to not criticize Israel publicly in order to maintain Israel's security in that way, but that's going to result in a lot of American Jews drifting away, one might argue that that's the cost that we have to pay in order to keep Israel there, because Israel is ultimately the most important thing to have a place of refuge for Jews. I know I'm asking a hypothetical that is based on a premise that you don't agree with, but I'm asking you in a way, how would you respond to people who raise that concern?
No, look, I as an American Jew who is deeply committed to Israel's survival, I also think that although I'm not facing the security issues that Israelis face, and one has to, anyone who doesn't think that context isn't extremely complicated, about which reasonable people can disagree. But I do not think we should be asked to check what I feel are my Jewish values at the door. And when Israeli leaders engage in the worst forms of ethno-nationalism to suggest that their own Arab citizens under the nationality law don't quite count anymore, and that there aren't concerns in terms of the treatment of Palestinians in the West Bank, I'm sorry. I think, look, the thing that encourages me is the views I have are shared by a significant fraction of the Israeli public. And I think the attempts by the American Jewish community to silence those who are critical of Netanyahu is wrong. And I'm not prepared to be silenced. And I guess I don't believe, I believe, I'm among those who believe, like many Israelis, that in the long run, the way Israel can survive as a Jewish and democratic state is ultimately to still aim towards a two-state resolution, although God knows it's getting harder and harder because of the expansion of West Bank settlements. But anyway, I know people can reasonably disagree with my perspective, but that's what it is. And I think that, and I guess I think that what's so interesting, I don't think I'm so unusual in this respect. I see my liberal and largely democratic values, democratic in terms of the Democratic Party, as an expression of my Jewish values.
Yeah, as do I. Okay, so with that, let's open up for some questions. I'm going to give my mic to Tova so that she can have you talk into the mic.
Thank you so much for the wonderful conversation. Okay, let's start here.
I suspect you won't be upset if I don't discuss or ask you about the Israeli-American conflict. I guess, may I just quickly say that the question of intermarriage, there are statistics that show that when there's an intermarriage, a large fraction of the children are raised Jewish, and you get 2 Jewish children or 3 Jewish children for 1 Jew. And that 1 Jew is multiplied more strongly, and we may be gaining rather than losing, to be actual fact. And that was really
Can I just add a footnote, because I'm with you 100%. And indeed, the most recent study by Len Sachs and his group of children of intermarriage raised in the Boston area suggest where one of the spouses is not a Jewish convert, suggested that slightly over 60% were being raised as Jews. And I think what's really remarkable in America today is the extent that that's happening.
Yeah, and every 1 Jew gets that value. Anyway, forgive me. Now let me come after you a little bit, if I may. This has been very theoretical, in my opinion. And I think your comment quickly about the word that you use, vehicle, and all its ramifications applies here. I mean, there are a lot of words have been used that don't really have a specific meaning, I think, and it's disturbing. I guess I find some disturbance because this isn't the first time I've listened to discussion about having the so-called open tent, and anybody that feels personally strongly enough to want to be a Jew should become a Jew, whether or not should be called a Jew, whether or not he has any knowledge of the Judaism, is an issue that I think has been raised several times, and it causes me a little bit of agony. If you were a Gentile and had studied all that you've studied about Judaism, it's one thing, but that's not the case normally. And I think I have to ask you that you keep expressing how it's desirable to transfer to your grandchildren this sense of being Jewish. And of course, that is there's something about the totality of Judaism throughout the world that has a common feel to it. And my attitude is that if you have access, if you apply access to someone who says, gee, I have Jewish friends, and they're nice guys or nice ladies, I'm going to join this club and I'll be a Jew. And then I think that after 30, 40 years, you're going to have to ask yourself whether or not the Judaism that the community has that is doing that, whether that hasn't changed very dramatically toward becoming less Jewish significantly. And so I ask you, it's the slippery slope kind of thing where, the president and the vice president of the shul are now suddenly, but you understand my question. I'd appreciate your comment on that and tell me whether or not you think there is an issue that ought to be considered here.
Look, I think the point you raise is a fair one. And it affects the American community generally, quite apart from intermarriage. And that is, for many American Jews, with 2 Jewish parents and 4 Jewish grandparents, their commitment and their knowledge is very thin. And they don't know much about their heritage. And in terms of how they're living their lives, they probably couldn't answer my question of what difference it's making. But they may take pride in being Jewish. That's a problem. It's a problem. But on the other hand, it's a problem that can be partially resolved, I think, through education, through community, through commitment to institutions. But I guess I don't connect it to intermarriage. As I really connect it to the extent to which are they struggling with figuring out, well, what does it mean to them to be Jewish? Is it just
non-Jewish people coming
Yes.
in who have no talent, no interest, no experience, no knowledge of Judaism, coming into the big tent, which is what you're saying is you have to have this desire to be Jewish. I'm asking you whether that, in the long run, might not be a downside to Judaism that's significant. I'm asking you to think about that aspect.
okay? And what I'd ask you to think about is if we continue a tradition where we don't embrace those who want to enter, who, after all, there are Jews who, in fact, think that someone with only one Jewish parent really isn't Jewish. Well, it's not right halakhically, but psychologically, I assure you it's right. Okay? And what that reflects is kind of almost a racial notion of what it means. You know, there's a story in my book about 2 people who do 23andMe, and the young man ends up being 76% Ashkenazi, and his girlfriend is 91%, and she says to him, I always knew I was more Jewish than you were. You know, and they sort of say that as a joke, but there's an aspect of that. And I think my book, in a way, is a plea to move away from dissent as the critical defining criterion. And I think that for the American community, it's going to really be important. And I guess, well, look, if we had a mechanism for secular conversion, I'd be sympathetic. In other words, where the smaller tent would be, that apart from identifying yourself as a Jew, we're going to give you a little bit of a test, whether you know enough. Now, part of the problem is many in our world would flunk the test. And that is a piece of the dilemma.
Okay, next question.
Exactly. And could we ever have a consensus? We don't have a pope, after all.
You described yourself as far Jewishness thin.
Myself?
Yeah.
No, I don't think I don't think my Jewishness is thin.
Well,
My education in Judaism
was thin.
is thin.
And I presume that those of your kids became thinner. And now you're coming to the 3rd generation.
My children, it's thicker than it is for me.
Really?
No, I'm serious.
So why are you so concerned with the 3rd generation slipping away that now you're trying to find ways how to embrace them? What could you have done differently in your lifetime so you would not be faced today with that dramatic thing to embrace them?
Well, that's a fair question. I have a chapter about this, and I'm not saying that I'm not holding myself up or our family up as exemplary, okay? And that is if you're serious about wanting to raise your children to have a Jewish identity, how might you best do it? How do you do it? And I think it's a real challenge in a way for those of us who are not religious. You know, what I ended up saying in the book is, you may not be religious, but you ought to join a temple or a synagogue, you know, to have some institutional mechanism to start the process of education. And you better start educating yourself and carry on certain traditions. I regret very much that in our immediate family, we did not celebrate Shabbat with a Friday night dinner. I mean, for example, I think that's a wonderful and beautiful a way one could do it. And I think there are many things one might do. And it turns out, by the way, the most important things probably are the things done in the home with your immediate family. So I don't say how I was raised is necessarily the best way to do it. The other thing that I find absolutely thrilling is right here in this community center, there are educational programs of all sorts that are not religious. They're not involving prayer, where scores of people are involved my age. In other words, we're old, eager to learn more about our heritage. And there are opportunities to do that. And I think it's fantastic. I mean, my brother belongs to a congregation that has a Talmud class at 9 o'clock every Saturday morning. And then services are at 10:30. And I went to the Talmud class with him. He and his wife go pretty regularly. And there's a good sized crowd, much bigger than the crowd at services at 10:30. And I'd be happy if maybe the crowd at services were bigger too. But I'm using that as an example that, I mean, I think that there's a thirst for more knowledge about our heritage that many people like me who were not very well educated along the way are really very excited about expanding our knowledge base. And I think that's just terrific. And in America, it's a lot more important than probably in Israel, where the whole culture is embedded with all kinds of Jewish symbols.
If I may just add about what you just said, I think in this community, we keep asking ourselves this question about Jewish education and whether, and I hope it's not too bold the way I'm putting it, you can blame my Israeliness, whether paying the tax of religiousness is necessary. So I want thick, meaningful, deep, intellectual Jewish education for myself and for my kids. And the question is, what's the best framework for that? We do know what the options are. And is it time for us here to create the next kind of platform? Because we see that it's very much needed. So just to kind of put this comment in the context. Yes.
Thank you, Tova. So I really loved your book, and I really like the proposal that you have for the big tent and how the organizations at their own level can decide their criteria. But my question is, have you thought about how we would come together? Maybe, like Dan was saying, is it one identity that we all would hold that's the same? But how would we heal in a way so that we don't have that good Jew, bad Jew thing, right? Because if there are all of those different types of Jews, me in a perfect world would like to think that we're all Jews and we all accept each other. I accept whatever type of Jew you want to be. I don't really care. You know, it's your choice. So, but I've lost my mic. I think that the thing that we need to do is think about how to begin to accept all those different types and feel like we are part of one thing, and that regardless of the type of Jew you are, that the fact that you identify yourself as a Jew, that's a good thing. And I just wondered if you had thought at all about how we could go about sort of healing our sort of psyche to get away from the labels and get down to the fact that more Jews might be a good thing.
Well, I think that you pose a really wonderful question, and it really goes to acceptance and tolerance. And by the way, many Jews like me who are not religiously committed, I find intolerant in terms of their dealings with Orthodox Jews, or especially ultra-Orthodox Jews. I'm one of the great privileges I've had is at Harvard Law School, we now have every year a few students who really aren't university graduates when they come to law school. They're kids that have been in a yeshiva the whole way. And sometimes now they get a degree, but it's not what you'd recognize as a liberal arts degree at all. And because of seminars and classes, I've really gotten to know in a way that I assure you, growing up in Kansas City, I never did. And it's been fantastic. I find it extremely interesting. And they say they've enjoyed taking seminars from me and have even learned some things from me, you know, relating to the kinds of things in my book, which I also find thrilling and kind of, I'm sort of stunned that it's true, because about religious things, they are deeply knowledgeable. But I think that I personally love that. It's great. And yet the divisions within the community are pretty deep. And I think there's a lot of mutual recrimination about people you disagree with.
Under English hereditary law, after the son is the third in line, it then reverts back to being just John. You can't have a fourth. So did you have any concern when your daughter married this gentleman who is Cornelius after the third?
He was already the fifth.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, they're living in America and they've been in America a long time. And I'll tell you, I'll give you a small anecdote. I said to Allison when she said to me, you know, we're going to have a boy. This is their second child. And Corey really wants to name him Cornelius, etc. I said to Allison, my daughter, I said, Allie, you know, the Jewish tradition is you're not supposed to name someone after a living person. And she smiled and she says, well, we're not going to call him Cornelius. That's kind of a silly name. It's too highfalutin. She said, we're going to call him Eli. Dale's deceased father's first name was Eli. And I knew my daughter had just out-negotiated me. So, you know, all I can report is on the birth certificate, there's a V1, the sixth. On the passport too.
Hi. Okay. But first of all, really big fan of the podcast. So great to sort of meet you. I wanted to relay a quick anecdote that happened really recently and ask a question about it. My mom's not Jewish, my dad is, and as such, I was raised in a pretty secular, half Jewish, quote unquote, household. And the other day, my Jewish friend kind of joked that I was kind of the Rachel Dolezal of Jews. And for people who don't kind of know who that is, that's the white woman who pretended to be black to be in the NAACP, and that was pretty hurtful. And to black people, for me, I read it as a joke, and he's my friend and everything. But I was wondering, it brought up some questions for me about how we reconcile this sort of race aspect of it as it relates to trauma as a people. And I recognize that you want to sort of open up the umbrella, and even for people who might have no parents who were Jewish, I think that his words, small but hurtful as they might have been, sort of reflect some sort of real feeling that there's sort of this there might be a racial aspect, even if it was imposed upon these people. So I'm just wondering how you respond to criticisms like that.
Well, basically, I mean, I want to embrace you, and I think that it's terribly important for our vibrancy in America that we do, because you're hardly an exception. In the book, I talk about Angela Buckdahl. Do you know about her? Angela Buckdahl's mother is Korean, and her father's Jewish, and she was raised as a Reform Jew, and she now is, and she describes the pain she suffered because, of course, looking Asian was even an additional reason that many American Jews of Ashkenazi heritage had a hard time thinking of her as really being Jewish. And she describes these extremely painful experiences she had growing up. She is today, by the way, the chief rabbi of what's called Central Synagogue in New York City, which is an extraordinary, it's one of the great synagogues in America. So fight back.
Thank you.
So to add one comment on this, that I translated an Israeli novel about the life of Rabbi Akiva. And there's a famous story in the story of Rabbi Akiva where he goes into, quote, an orchard, some kind of mystical experience. And the four people went in and they came out in different ways. And in the novel, the character named Ben Azai goes crazy, and the character named Ben Zoma dies. Now, every educated Jew who reads this book comes up to me and says, she got it wrong. There's a mistake in the book. And I say, well, what's the mistake? He says, well, in the story, it's Ben Zoma who goes crazy and Ben Azai who dies. And I am always take great pleasure in this question because I say, that is true. That is the story in the Babylonian Talmud. But the story in the Jerusalem Talmud, which is actually earlier than the Babylonian Talmud, is the way she has it in the book, meaning the person who thinks they're the most educated Jew turns out to be the only Jew who's wrong, right? Because and it's actually the Jew who didn't know it, who actually learns the story, I mean, arguably the right way from this novel. And that's a roundabout way of saying that there's an interesting thing for those of us who really study our sources, which is, for example, after the Exodus from Egypt, the Torah is very clear that what it calls an Erev Rav, a mixed multitude, joins the freed slaves and essentially becomes part of the Jewish people by voluntary association, by public declaration. There was no conversion. There was no, they accepted on themselves. There was not much to accept because Judaism hadn't really been invented yet. That only came after they got to Sinai. So, were these people not Jews for the 2 weeks until they got to Sinai? Well, nobody was, I guess, if that was the case. In the dawn of rabbinic Judaism, it's very clear from the Talmud after the destruction of the Second Temple that a large number of the early rabbis were themselves from non-Jewish backgrounds. Whether they converted or not, it's very unclear. Was there any such thing as conversion in those days? So I think one thing that's really important is to understand that ideas like this that seem kind of shocking today, it makes me think sometimes of the Seinfeld episode where his dentist converts just so they can tell Jewish jokes. And Seinfeld is very upset about he converted just for the jokes, right? But there's a way in which that's actually part of our heritage too. And if we don't know about some of those elements and we are sort of shocked by the idea that we might have that kind of open policy again today, especially, and say, well, is that really doing honor to the suffering of the Jews, to the Holocaust? Well, this was right after the destruction of the Second Temple. So these are so I think that actually it bears deep learning and also deep consideration to imagine that a more open policy is actually part of our heritage, if not more so than any of these more restrictive approaches.
I think we have time for one last question. Avia, you wanted to ask?
So I have two grandchildren. They grew up with a Jewish education, but now they're out in college. And I wonder, what do they have to do to stay Jewish, because they don't keep the mitzvot? They just have their, I would say, heritage as growing up through Hebrew school, but now they're out of Hebrew school and they behave like normal secular American. So what should I expect them to do to nevertheless stay Jewish?
All of our children and grandchildren are works in progress. And it may be that you're not going to be able to control it. But I think that my own feeling is that with any luck, life is reasonably long, and the importance people attach to being Jewish for many is not a constant throughout their life. And you may find that, in fact, at some later period, they're going to attach considerable importance to it. And they may once again become more observant, or maybe not. But that's part of the challenge of living in a society where people have choices.
So in the after the destruction of the first temple during the Babylonian exile, there was a feeling that the temple had been destroyed and it wasn't coming back. It turned out that it did come back, but they didn't know at the time, and they thought that the priesthood was over. And in the book of Exodus, it's attributed by biblical scholars to the P source, which is a source of the Bible that was written in the Babylonian exile. So after the destruction of the first temple, there's a statement that God says to the people of Israel that you should be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy people, meaning there are no more priests. The priesthood is gone. Now everybody has to be a priest. And there was a notion, and you could be scandalized by that. A priest is by lineage. A priest is learned in the ways of bringing the sacrifices. But the Jewish heritage in the Babylonian exile said, no, that was true, but now we all have to shoulder that responsibility. And Bob, I want to thank you, because I think that what you're doing in taking this project on is essentially helping us see the potential for the next version of that, which, I've been trying to think about, like, what is it after the old institutions that we've known are sort of falling apart, and we don't really believe in a monarchy anymore. So I was thinking that it would be, and it's not about priests, it's about rabbis. So I was thinking that the update of that line would be something that we're a republic of rabbis, right? That all of us now have the duty that only the rabbis used to hold, which was that we all have to sort of shoulder this responsibility of creating the Judaism that's going to work for our day. And I think that you show us the way by bringing your expertise and your passion, which is not really invited by a lot of the powers that be in the Jewish world, but say, no, I have something to say about this. So I want to say that I loved your book. I am so glad that you wrote it. I want to let our audience here know remind you that it's for sale in the back, and Bob will be happy to sign it. And I think it's a really important book, not only because of its content, also because of its content, but because of your opening a path for others of us to feel confident to come in and engage with the future of Judaism, even though we're not official rabbis, but we're now part of this new Republic of Rabbis. So thank you so much for being here with us tonight, and thank you for doing this.
And I want to thank Dan Libenson who is our partner in creating this discourse and conversation and doing new types of Jewish doing. Thank you so much for helping us bring Bob and just to let you know that we have a series called Judaism, the New Basics. We're learning Torah every Wednesday night. Feel free to look it up. You're all very, very, very welcome to join us. Good night. Thank you for coming.